Stop me if you've had this problem before. You've got something that you want to delete. In my case, it's tasks. I've got a lovely confirmation pop-up. I want to give the user a chance to change their mind. But what I realize is that this pop-up is actually really similar to the one that I need for a different data type. Projects, right? Are you sure you want to delete this project? Really, yeah, that pop-up's like pretty similar. It's missing, I don't really need the helper text for projects for some reason in this silly example, but otherwise it's like identical. And then maybe also like, I've got another place where I need a very similar pop-up, which is like just telling the user like, hey, you can't do that because you're not an admin. Like all these pop-ups are like slightly different, but like quite similar. Do I really need to create 3 different pop-ups to achieve this? That's gonna take me a lot of time, and I like my time. What if I was to tell you that this pop-up, and this pop-up, and this pop-up are all exactly the same? And what's more, right, are you sure you wanna delete Stereo Newspaper back? I can confirm this, and it's gonna remove that because it was a dubious ethical task to put on my list to begin with. And then projects, let's say I wanna create a new cohort-based Bubble course. I hit confirm, that's deleted too. It's all one pop-up. It's one reusable element in Bubble. It's called Pop-Up General Simple, right? And I'm using it in all those different contexts, and I'm gonna show you how to build it in Bubble. Let's go. All right, so this is our starting point, is this dashboard page. We've got tasks and projects, a repeating group inside of each, and inside of the cells of those repeating groups is this little delete icon. So that's what I want to configure for both tasks and projects. And this is how it's set up within the editor. Very simple. We've got a group for tasks and a group for projects. And obviously I've got some conditional visibility on this. So if you want to see the exact configuration that I'm using here, then you can check out the link to the editor below. So the first thing I want to do, I want to actually just have a pop-up that I can turn into this reusable confirmation module, right? So obviously you can create your own pop-up. I'm going to make use of the wonderful Basis UI design library, and I'm going to copy this pop-up number 1 and paste that onto the page here. And just before we go into configuring this, I think it's worth just conceptually trying to understand what we're going to do here. So if this is our pop-up, we essentially want all of these guys, all of the guys that I'm going to just highlight here in blue. These are all going to be dynamic properties, right? Properties which we can swap out depending on the context. So as an example, if we imagine the first context is that we're deleting tasks, right? We're on this page, we click on a task, right? And we want the confirmation pop-up to appear. So we're going to feed in certain properties that are going to inhabit these placeholder values that we've configured within the module, right? So delete, create YouTube video. That's what we're going to push into the title. The delete label is what we're going to push into the primary button's text. And then, are you sure you want to delete this task? That's what we're going to push into this helper text, right? If you imagine that all of these properties here, all of these placeholder values are essentially just windows through which we push our new values, right? They themselves don't hold any value, right? They're just a container that we push stuff through. In the same way that you place a text element on the page and you feed a dynamic data source from the current user's full name or whatever have you, right? This works in exactly the same way. So in this context here, we would see something like this. We're going to delete the create YouTube video and we'll see these new labels. And of course, we can do the same thing in a different context. That's the beauty about using reusable element properties, about building things in a modular way. We're going to feed different values depending on the context. Now we're deleting projects, so the label is going to be slightly different. The primary button label is going to be the same, but the helper text is going to be slightly different. So we see a slightly different pop-up. And then really, to take this to its full potential, this feature, right, means we don't necessarily just have to use this pop-up for deleting things, right? We can use it for anytime that we need to show a message to the user within a pop-up where that message fits within certain constraints. We could repurpose this for actually giving a warning when a user tries to create a project and let's say that they're not authorized, they don't have the right permissions, right? So we could feed different values here and say, hey, you can't do that as the pop-up text, some different helper text, that's all fine. But we can feed something even more interesting, which is this little nugget here, I'm basically calling a variant, right? It is a way that we're going to tell this pop-up essentially, what type of pop-up are you in this context, right? Maybe the variant over here, I neglected to add this in, but really what is implicit here is the variant in this context is delete. The same thing up here for deleting tasks, deleting projects. But the variant down here, when we're actually just giving a warning, we could say, yeah, it's info or it's warning, right? We can give it some different variant. And depending on the variant that we feed, we can do other things like change the layout, change the colors, change any kind of styling properties that are going to make the pop-up look different. So in this case, let's say we actually have removed the cancel button, and we could even center align this stuff as well. You could do anything that you want in order to make this pop-up feel different. But the key thing is that under the hood, it's the same pop-up, right? This pop-up is the same as this, is the same as this. It's just that depending on the values that we feed to it, it morphs, it takes on a different shape, right? It adapts to the context in which we put it. So let's get concrete. Let's go into the editor and let's set this up. So we've got our pop-up here. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to convert it to a reusable element, right? And I'm just going to give it a little simple naming convention here. And we'll call this our pop-up, call it our pop-up general simple, let's say, because we're using it in a general context and it's a simple pop-up that is just mainly showing some information. So now we are editing the reusable element. We're editing this pop-up. And the first thing that I want to do is I basically need to configure what are these guys? What are inputs that this pop-up accepts, right? Because what's implicit here is that there are a few inputs like pop-up title, helper text, primary, button label, and of course we've talked about here the variant, right? These are all inputs that this pop-up is configured to accept, and depending on the value that we feed into each of these, it's going to take on a different shape, a different form. So to configure these guys, to configure these inputs, all we have to do is bring up the element inspector for the reusable, and we just add a new property over here. Okay, so our first one, call it title, and we need to give it a type as well. So you can choose a few different things. Dynamic value is what you'll be using the majority of the time. And we just give it here a type of thing, right? And in our case, it's just of type text, right? That's all we're feeding into this pop-up is text. But note that you can feed, I'll skip over this for a second, but you notice that you can feed, other than text, you can feed all kinds of different data types, right? You can feed all the so-called primitives, text, numbers, that sort of thing, but also actual data types from your database, option sets, okay? So this is where things start to become powerful and which we'll start to leverage in a little bit. But for now, let's just finish setting this up. So of course, it's not a list, right? It's not a long text. Long text gives us a slightly different input for filling this out. And it's actually not optional. We could leave this as optional and give a default value if the user doesn't provide something, but we want to actually basically tell the developers of this application, ourselves and anyone we're working with, that no, this pop-up, it requires a value in order to work, okay? So we're going to untick that. So that's the title. Okay, and then we just go all the way through and just set this up as one property. Okay, where do we want this input to manifest within this reusable element, within this title, right? So what we want to do is we want to set this as a dynamic data source, just like if we were feeding it from the database, just like if we were feeding it from current user's full name or whatever have you, right? I'm going to right-click clear expression here, except this time we can actually click on the pop-up and we can feed the title value that is given, all right? So I'm going to actually just go through and just set this up just with the title, just to show you how it works start to finish. So if we go back to our app page, okay, here's the pop-up that we added before, right? I'm actually going to remove that, and I'm going to look in my elements tree, and I'm going to find my pop-up general simple that we added before. Okay, so there it is on the page. And notice here, here's the element inspector for this reusable element. And notice here, we have now this input field, right? This is what we just configured over when we were editing the reusable element. So now here, I can say basically whatever I want, right? I can say, hello, YouTube, and then configure this in some context, right? So if I remove my search expression here, let's say when I click on this on this icon, right? This is just for demonstration purposes, of course. I'm going to show that pop-up general. And there you go. Hello, YouTube, right? Now, from here, right, the question is, okay, how do you configure this to operate in multiple places, okay? In this kind of simple example, you could get really crude with it, right? And you could just simply, I could just create another instance, as you would call it, of this pop-up, right? So this is now my general delete confirmation task, right? If I want another one for my projects, right? Here I can just say something like, what did we say was our deleting task? Right, there you go. So you could say, are you sure you want to delete this project? Could be the question on the delete confirmation for projects. And then, are you sure you want to delete this task, right, for the delete confirmation tasks, right? And then over on my repeating group of projects, I would just have another workflow to show the other instance of this pop-up. Okay, so over here, we've got one for tasks. Are you sure you want to delete this task? And then on projects, we've got another one. Are you sure you want to delete this project? Okay, that's all fine. But you might be asking, but what about the dynamic data that we want to push in here based on what we're actually deleting, right? We had the example here of we're passing in the name of the task that we're deleting, right? Or we're passing in the name of the project that we're deleting. Okay, so how do we do that? Depending on the architecture of your page, this might work slightly differently. What I would actually recommend, which is not how it's set up here just for simplicity, is that this entire row here is a reusable element unto itself, right? So if I was going to convert this to a reusable element, and we'll say this is a row project. Now, I'm not going to configure everything here. The data source of this reusable is a project. Our pop-up general simple could live here. And then in the title, we could say, are you sure you want to delete? And then add in the name from this row projects project, right? And if that is a little confusing for you, don't worry too much. This is a separate topic about how to architect your app. Leave a comment below if you want some more information, or check out my course where we go into this in a lot more detail. But this is how you could handle, the setup where you've got a lot of modularity already in your application. If you're just starting out and you're just getting a feel for this, then I'd recommend just going for an approach like this, where you have your two pop-ups, your two instances of the same reusable on the page. But you just need to store what you're handling somewhere, right? And the easiest place to handle that is in a custom state, right? And I always like to store custom states on the highest level in your element hierarchy. So in our case, that's this application page. If your group tasks here and your group projects were their own reusable element, which again, this is going to the topic of how do you structure an application, then in that case, the custom state would live at the top level there. But I'm digressing a little bit. I don't want to confuse you too much. Keep it really simple. If you're copying along, you want to be able to store what is being deleted somewhere on the page so that you can pass it to the pop-up, okay? So we're going to click here on this little eye icon on the page, and we're going to add a new custom state, and we'll call this the selected, or actually probably better would be the active task, which is of type task. And we'll create another one for the active project. Okay, and we're going to see how we're actually going to use this as well when we get into deleting a particular project or task based on a trigger from the pop-up. What we could do now, we're going a little bit of an intermediary step here. So if I try to illustrate that here, if you imagine this is our custom state, right? Our custom state, the value here is basically a project name, project title, right? This guy up a little bit. And the output, I'll just use a different one. The output is then going to be the name, right? It might be, design kit version 2. That is the value stored within this custom state, which then gets fed into the input for the reusable element. So let's configure this connection here from the custom state to the input to the reusable. So if we go, we'll do our task guy first. Are you sure you want to delete this task? We could say instead, are you sure you want to delete, and I'll just add it inside of a couple of apostrophes, and then insert dynamic data, and we'll point this to the app's active tasks title, right? And then all we have to do is we have to make sure that there is a value inside of that custom state before we show the pop-up. So over where we are clicking this icon over here, and we give it a nice little blue color so we can find it later on, right? Right before this, we basically need to set the value for this custom state. So I'm going to right click, insert an action. I'm going to set the state for the page, which we're calling app. Which custom state am I setting? The active task. Which active task am I setting? Since this button icon was clicked inside of this row here, all right, in this row, I've used this naming convention to indicate that there's data inside of this row, and the data is just being pulled from the current sales task inside of this repeating group. Because this button, this icon is inside of this cell, we have access to that cell's data, i.e. we have access to that cell's task. We have access to this group's data source. I'm going to just pull it from that group, D, list row items, task. Now, if I click on one of these guys, we should see, are you sure you want to delete update app analytics? Are you sure you want to delete integrate referral program? Okay, so you get the idea. Now, some of you are more familiar with Bubble will be asking what you could just set the custom state on the reusable element itself, couldn't you? Like every reusable element, we've got our pop-up general simple here. Every reusable element has its own custom states, right? And these can actually be set from the host page or the host reusable. Okay, so why not just set it here? And the short answer is it'll work just fine. But generally speaking, because Bubble now has this reusable element properties feature, I find that any input value that I want, even if it is going to be one that's going to be set through a workflow ultimately, it's going to be easy to keep those all organized in one place, which is the reusable element properties section. Custom states have an additional function, as we're going to see when it comes to reusable elements, which is providing outputs that the page or the host element, the host reusable, can access. And just to illustrate that really clearly is like this helper text, for example, this doesn't need to be something that we define in a workflow. So on our app page here where I've got the delete confirmation for the task, right? If we now set up our property for this helper text, right? So I'm going to add a new property. We'll call it helper text. Again, it's going to be of type text. It's not going to be optional. Actually, we could have it optional. That would be fine. And we'll actually say that it's a long text this time. And maybe for the default text, I'll just copy what's here. I'll just copy what's here and paste that in. And now we'll set the value of this text element to be the helper text. Okay, so I've got that set up. So as I was saying, to illustrate sort of the power of reusable element properties is the helper text here, because I know that this pop-up delete confirmation is just operating for tasks, right? I can just put in some value and just say, are you sure you want to delete this task? This cannot be undone. And if I try to open this up, you'll see, hey, there we go. Now, if I did this via custom state instead, so if instead on my pop-up, I had a custom state, I'm going to add a custom state here on my pop-up, and we call this again helper text, and I'll just add CS next to it so we know when we're looking at it later that it's a custom state and not a property. And we set this to be of type text. Okay, we create that. I could point this to, instead of the helper text, which is up here in the properties, I could point it to the custom state instead. Okay, but that means that now on my app page, I have to explicitly remember to add an action to set the state of that pop-up delete confirmation task, helper text CS. And now I can add my value here. So it's a little bit more laborious. And it also means that we're not following a programming principle called separation of concerns, which basically says that I shouldn't, as a developer, have to know that to get this pop-up working properly, I've got to, before I show it, set a custom state on it called helper text CS. Like, that is not something that I should have to think about, right? It should be easy and obvious how to use this module wherever I drop it into the page. Of course, documentation is good, but how much easier is it for us to just put in some helper text here? And inside of our pop-up, we're going to have all the logic that knows how to handle this and how to handle what happens when it's not present as well. But the properties, by their very nature, give us basically a description of how this module, how this reusable element is meant to be configured. Custom states aren't like that, right? Because it's not obvious where they live, what they are, I would have to document somewhere, probably on the pop-up itself, I would have to say, hey, this is how to use, right? And I would say, oh, you can, to get helper text. It's just silly, right? It's just extra work for literally no good reason. So we want to keep using properties wherever we can. And the other reason really is that if you did have your row project here, then as I said, you just define the dynamic value for the thing that you're deleting right there within the property. You don't have to use a custom state at all, right? So that's a little aside, but probably helpful, useful context just to think about the different ways that you can solve problems in Bubble. So I'm just gonna go back and fix the pop-up as we'd configured it to make sure that we're pointing to the helper text, and I'm gonna delete that custom state entirely so it doesn't confuse us later. But now you can see how for both of these delete confirmations, right, I can, are you sure you want to delete this project, right? I can add different values. This is, are you sure you want to delete this project? This is, are you sure you want to delete this task? And then of course, depending on what I'm deleting, we're going to have different values fed into it. Okay, so already some really powerful functionality here. Now, an additional kind of thing that we can configure here is you noticed that when we configured the pop-up, right, we said that this helper text is actually optional, okay? User doesn't have to provide it. So what happens if on my pop-up delete project, we remove it entirely? We could do something to the layout of this pop-up depending on whether or not there is actually helper text present, right? So this is a common practice with these kind of elements is this helper text element, the text element itself. I can configure this to not be visible on page load by default. I want to say that when it's not visible, we want to collapse it. Okay, so it's going to collapse the space that it would otherwise inhabit. And then we don't have to worry about any of its height settings whatsoever. And then all I'm going to do is I'm going to add a condition under which it should be visible, right? And that condition can be anchored onto whether or not we actually have an input value for the helper text property present or not, right? So we can say when that helper text is not empty, right? In that case, then we're going to make the element visible. So that means that on our project here, right, it's not going to look very different. And on our tasks, right, we're going to appear as normal. Now, I'll show you that to ease you into the idea that the layout of this element itself, of this pop-up, can be different depending on the input values, depending on the properties. It's not just about replacing content. It's about anchoring on logic, conditional logic about how things should appear and behave based on those properties. So I want to get into the example here of having a different variant of this pop-up where we have, this is our delete one that we've been configuring, but what if we want to have more, just a confirmation pop-up like this, just to make sure someone's read the message, okay? And then after that, we're going to learn how do we actually anchor onto a button click so that we can then do stuff on the host page when an action is taken within the module, within the reusable. But let's start here. Let's start with this variant issue. So the best way to do this is to have a reference for your variants somewhere that you can feed into the pop-up. And then anchor your conditional logic based on the variant that appears, okay? And somewhere where you can store them is going to be an option set, right? We want to do that within an option set. For any kind of like developer configuration stuff, I like to use a little cog icon before them just to make it appear a little nicer. So I'm going to say pop-up, we'll call this a pop-up basic variant. That's what we can call this, right? And we can have two variants here. We can have a delete variant, and we can have maybe an informational variant, right? And this now can be something that we feed into this pop-up, right? So we can have a new property, which we call variant, which is going to now be of type pop-up basic variant, right? I call it pop-up basic because maybe we've got different reusable elements for different types of pop-ups that we're using in the application, right? They might not all be this pop-up basic. And we're going to say this is not optional. You must provide this. And now we can add some interesting logic here. So we could say something like, okay, we know that in the informational variant, this cancel button that's otherwise present is hidden, right? So now we could do something like, okay, again, let's set this to be invisible by default. And then we can say, hey, when the pop-up's variant is delete, right? Only in that situation do I actually want you to be visible. And otherwise we're going to collapse you, right? And then equivalently for this button is right now set to fit its width to content. So it's just gonna, when the cancel button disappears, you can see how it behaves. It's just gonna slot over to the left-hand side and keep that small width. But what if we want it to extend the full width of the pop-up like we have here in our mock-up? So we can add a condition on the button, and that condition can say when that pop-up general simples variant is informational, and then we can do something to make the button extend that full width. Now this is where things are going to get slightly a little hacky, because this property, fit width to content, isn't exposed here within the conditional logic builder. We could actually use something slightly different to hack our way to success here, essentially. We're going to set the minimum width of this button to be not pixels, but a percentage. We're going to set this to be 100%. Okay. What that means is this button is going to take up 100% of the width of its parent element, right? The parent element in this case is group actions. So group actions is taking up all of this space. So the button is going to extend to be 100% the width of that parent, okay? Except for the padding. The padding is actually still going to be enforced on the button, but it's going to, other than that, try to be as large, as wide as it can be inside of its parent. So just to test this out, if we've got, let's say we've got our group projects here, right? And we want to have some conditional logic. So I've got some logic that says when this project is clicked, then we're going to show these values. That when the project button is clicked, then we're going to launch a pop-up to create a project. So let's add some conditional logic on this to protect it, so that this only happens when the current user's role is admin. Okay. If you're wondering how I do that, in our data structure here, we've got a user. One of the user's fields is a role, and that role is set to an option set called role, where we store the different roles that the user has. This comes out of the box with the basis starter template, by the way, but it's a very common structure for handling user permissions within your application. So nothing revolutionary here. But let's create an equivalent workflow here. I'm going to right-click, copy and paste to create another workflow with the inverse condition. And here I'm going to delete. Okay, so I've got an inverse condition when the current user's role is not admin. Okay, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create another version of my pop-up. So I'm just going to copy the reusable element that already exists, and we're going to call this pop-up create project warning. Okay, and now we can feed it with the values that we want here. So sorry you can't do that. Sorry you can't do that. Only team admins can create projects. Right? Only team admins can create projects. And then the variant, right? The variant here is going to be, of course, informational. And on our other pop-ups, we have to remember that we want to set the variant to be delete because it is a required property. And then in our workflow, when that button is clicked and the user's role is not admin, in that case, we want to show the pop-up create project warning that we just configured. And so now I am logged in as a standard type user, not an admin. So if I click this, we should see, and we do, the pop-up appear. Now time to actually have this pop-up do something, like, because we've got this delete icon here, we want to delete this project. Yes, when we click this button, we need something to happen in the workflow tab, right? We need to, in our example here, delete the thing we click this delete icon in, right? The row here. So how do we do that? First things first, if I go back into the pop-up, right, let's just get ourselves ready for this scenario by configuring a label for the button, right? So I'm going to add a new property. It's the only property that we haven't added yet, which is called the primary. We'll call it the primary button label. And of course, that's going to be a text value as well. We actually will leave this one as optional, but we're going to provide a default value so that it's never empty, right? So the default value, just in case no one can be bothered to set it, will just be confirm, right? But on our app page, we could say different things. So we could override it with I understand, okay? You get the idea. So all that means is that now that we have that property configured, right, we just have to map it to this button's text, right? So we're going to say the dynamic data source for the label for this button is going to be the primary button label. And so how that's going to look, of course, when we try to delete something, oh, it looks like we've got a little bug there. So if we go to the app page and we see, what did we actually set here? Because we do have a default value. It looks like that default value that we thought we set didn't save. Let's make sure that we save it. Okay. Now, in theory, okay, even though we haven't set the value explicitly for that primary button label for our delete instances, it should still show up as confirmed. It does. And for our informational variant, we see something different. We see I understand. So that's working perfectly. But now, of course, this is where kind of the rubber hits the road, right? These pop-ups, especially this version, isn't really that useful unless we can send a signal back to the page to say that something happened. Because I'm going to go back to our example here where we're deleting tasks. Here's our pop-up, and the pop-up is, of course, living inside the context of the page, right? This reusable element is an instance inside of the page. And on the page, where we actually have all of the logic for deleting a thing, delete a thing, right? This is a crude representation of a workflow, right? This is the delete a thing workflow, right? I'm going to add this little stupid logic inside of a head icon to illustrate, okay? So because this workflow, let's be really clear, this workflow, delete a thing, lives on the page, we need to somehow have a way of the pop-up, the reusable element pop-up, communicating with the page, right? Communicating with the page in such a way that the page can then decide to execute this workflow delete a thing, right? Because this is the crux of the issue, is that what we could do on our pop-up General Simple, we could add a new property for task, right? Dynamic value task. And we could even have it as optional, right? So it could be empty. And we could then add some workflow to the button primary, which says, okay, when button primary is clicked and only when, we want this only to execute in the context where the user is deleting tasks. So we could say, okay, when the task isn't empty, and we assume that whenever we're using it for tasks, we're going to feed it a task, right? And we'll say when the variant is delete, right? In that case, what we could do is we could delete a thing, and we'll delete the task that we feed in. And that means that on our app page now, for our delete confirmation task, now we could actually feed in the task that we saved in that custom state earlier, right? And this would probably work. Go to tasks, okay, and let's say I want to delete this one. We've got a bug in our condition here. It says when it is empty. Actually, it's when it's not empty, of course. So if we try that and we click confirm, you see there it went, it disappeared. Okay, so that logic did work. So I guess you could say, why don't we do the same thing for anything that we want to delete? Right? So we've got tasks here, and then we'll go, okay, let's do it for projects as well. So we're going to add a dynamic value, project. We're going to set this up exactly the same way as we did for tasks, right? We need basically to recreate this action and say, actually, when it's the project that's not empty, right? This would work too. However, one of the problems with this, again, is the separation of concerns is not great. This pop-up is, in short, simple terms, it's trying to do too much, okay? The pop-up shouldn't have to handle any of the logic to do with our database, our data structure, managing, deleting, editing things, right? This pop-up's job should be to display information and tell the host page or host reusable when the user clicks a button. It's a really simple, self-contained module, okay? And building in a modular way like this, as your apps become more complex, is absolutely essential, because just notice all of how entangled this pop-up is now with the rest of our application's logic, like having to know about this data type called a task. So if we change that data type in the future to operate in a different way, it might have implications for this pop-up. When we want to delete other things in future, now we're going to have to add all of those different data types to this one pop-up just to keep it doing what it needs to do. And since we're doing this, like, we may as well just create 2, 3, 4, however many different data types we're working with. We may as well create that many different reusable element pop-ups, right? We may as well create another reusable element. If I clone this, and we'll call this the pop-up delete task, and another one for delete project, and another one for delete user, or delete whatever else we're going to do. And before we know it, we've defeated the purpose of using reusable element properties, trying to build in a modular way altogether. So this is definitely not the path that we want to go down. We want to be thinking about this reusable element. If we go up here, as this is probably the best illustration of it, as it's got a small number, a discrete number of inputs, okay? And it's got a discrete number of outputs. And all of the processing that it does, all the logic lives inside, okay? And so this can be our output, and the output is going to be basically a button clicked event, right? A button clicked event. And that event, which is not really something that Bubble's set up to handle natively, or set up to handle in an easy way, we're gonna show how we can do it. But that event is then going to be what the host page, come back over here, the host page is going to anchor onto, right? Right here is an output event button clicked. Really, it's the primary button that's clicked, okay? So how we set that up in Bubble, right? I'm going to just undo a whole bunch of the stuff that I did here. We need to have a way for a reusable element to communicate with the page in that direction, right? From the reusable element to the page. Now, there's a very limited amount of ways that we can do this. And the best way that I've found is to use a custom state on this reusable element, and we change the value of that custom state. And when that value changes, the page can detect it, okay? Because the page, if we go app here, right? The page has and every element really has a wonderful event trigger called do when condition is true. Do when condition is true, okay? So if we set this, we want to make sure we're running this every single time. And we can basically set this to listen for a change in that custom state on the pop-up. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to go into pop-up general simple. I'm going to add a new custom state here, okay? What I like to do with these, I'm going to get out my emoji keyboard. I like to use a little emoji for these because it's a trigger, so a lightning bolt, that feels appropriate. And so we're going to call it what it is, primary button clicked. Okay, that's the event that we're going to use here. Now, this is a binary thing, right? It either happens or it doesn't. We don't need to get fancy. It's going to be a yes, no. It's going to be defaulting to no, okay? Because by default, that button's not currently being clicked, right? What we're going to do is we're going to add a workflow. When that button primary is clicked, we're going to set the state of that primary button clicked, You're going to set it to yes. Okay. So that this pop-up can have this button be clicked multiple times, right? Because we might delete a thing, delete another thing, or the user might open the confirmation informational version of the pop-up that we have here multiple times. Okay. We need this to reset. Okay. So I'm going to copy this and I'm going to paste it. We're going to create an equivalent custom state, and that's going to set it back to no. Now, as this is set up right now, this isn't going to work. The main reason it's going to work is because we haven't set up the listener. So let's set up the listener event, aptly named, do when condition is true. Every time, all we're going to do, we're going to listen for when, in our case, this is for deleting a task, let's say. So for deleting a task, when that primary button clicked event happens on the delete confirmation task pop-up, and leaving it just like this is the same as saying is yes, by the way, then the thing we're going to do is delete a thing, right? And we're going to delete here. We're actually going to delete the task that this pop-up is holding, which we know that we're storing inside of active task, right? Because when we show the pop-up for the first time, right? When we show the pop-up for the first time, we're setting the value, as we showed earlier, to the task inside of the row that was clicked. So inside this guy here. So you might think this would work as it's set up. We're going to see for ourselves, of course. Hi, new video editor. I'm going to hit confirm. Nothing's happening. So you might find this if you're following along. If we go step by step, set it to yes, set it back to no. Do you see something change on the page there? If I go run next again, it's going to take us to the page event, the listener event. Okay, there it is. Do when pop-up delete confirmations, primary button clicked. Yep, that happened. So delete the task. You already saw it happen underneath the page. So why on earth is it working in step-by-step mode and not in normal mode? Ask Bubble. Straight up, ask Bubble. It's a quirk, and this feature, as it's not natively supported, right? This is the way that we handle it. I'm going to get to how you can lobby them to make it natively supported. But in the meantime, how we get this working and what step-by-step mode showed us was that basically this running in real time, it's been switched back to yes and being switched back to no too quickly for the page to pick it up. Or perhaps Bubble is executing this set no action before the yes one. I don't know, right? It's in their code base. You have to interrogate them. The way around it, the simple way around it, is to just add a tiny little pause. Navigation, add a pause before next action. It only has to be a millisecond, right? Your users aren't going to detect this. Now, if we try and do this and I hit confirm, watch the row underneath, boom, disappears. Okay. So that's the way around it, the simple way. There is one other way I'll just quickly show you at getting around this in case Bubble changes something and this doesn't work. The other way is to just have another custom event here, which you use to basically reset the primary button clicked. I'll call it reset event, right? And the only thing that this does is it sets the value back to no, right? So it resets that custom state. And then on the trigger event, what we actually do is we go and we schedule a custom event, not trigger, but schedule a custom event. And we don't even have to give it a delay, right? It can be 0 seconds. And this will basically force Bubble to do this, do the schedule action, and it does it in such a way that this then happens at such a method that the page can actually detect that little yes, no switch, right? Or rather the no, yes, no, yes, no, yes. So if I go and I delete this, create YouTube video, boom, right? It's gone underneath, okay? Now, like I said, this should be supported natively, right? So I'm gonna leave a link in the description to Bubble's idea board where this is being put as a request for Bubble. The more upvotes it gets, the higher the likelihood that they're gonna implement it. Tag them on Twitter, just contact them, send letters, do everything you can, because this ability to listen to an event that's triggered by another module, in our case, is standard programming stuff, Bubble. This is standard programming stuff. We should be able to do it natively. I should just be able to go trigger a global event or trigger a reusable event. And on the page, I should just be able to have an action here that is a an event was fired from this reusable element and then use that to execute my logic, right? I shouldn't need to do all these hacky workarounds. But nonetheless, despite the hackiness, in my humble opinion, this structure of having this separation of concerns, this decoupled architecture with logic, where this module does something very simple, which is like it takes a certain amount of inputs to display some information to the user, and then it sends a button click trigger back to the page, means that our app is like super easy to maintain. Like the logic for handling the deletion of tasks, right? It just lives here on the page, or ideally it lives in its own reusable element where we're showing this list of tasks. But nonetheless, this keeps things very maintainable. We're just like defining a module, defining all the interior logic for how it should maintain. And all we care about as a developer beyond that is what's the inputs, what's the outputs. And we can just latch onto them, write our own business logic in a different context, right? And then we know that if we need to change things in future, this module does this thing, this module does this thing, this is how they're connected, right? It's just like a very streamlined, easy, best practice way of handling complex applications. My point here is that despite the hackiness of getting this event firing logic working in Bubble, okay, this method of having this decoupled architecture and using this hacky event firing is still far superior than any other way of managing this. Just while we're here, to complete the picture, you'd also want to, of course, hide the pop-up afterwards within the pop-up, right? That's again, we're keeping this decoupled architecture, right? The pop-up knows to hide itself. The page doesn't have to know in which context to hide the pop-up, right? When the primary button is clicked, okay, whatever the primary action is, we want to hide that pop-up. So if I just create a new test task here with this pop-up that I prepared earlier, if I delete this, right, pop-up disappears. Okay, so now you know how reusable element properties work. You're going to be using this everywhere. It's not just for pop-ups, right? Banners, it could be like empty states, even tables. I've used this for like tables of data where like you want to show some columns in this context, other columns in another context, like anything where the general gist of the module remains the same, but there's like slight variations, slight tweaks depending on the context. Like great use case for using a reusable element, bake in some properties so that you can make it modular, use it in different contexts. You'll never build the same way again. So if you like this content, please let me know below. If you've got any questions, leave a comment. Otherwise, as always, happy bubbling.